The silence that fell across the Crithian armada was not the silence of fear, nor was it the calculated quiet of tactical assessment. It was the silence of incomprehension, the paralysis that grips a predator when it realizes, too late, that it has cornered something far more dangerous than itself. Commander Jathik's sensory appendages trembled as the human vessel materialized at the edge of the system. For 300 cycles, the Crithian Dominion had swept across this sector of space like a crimson tide, subjugating 47 civilizations, each more advanced than the last. Their doctrine was simple and had never failed: overwhelm with numbers, devastate with superior firepower, and absorb the remnants into the Dominion's ever-expanding collective. They had studied the humans extensively through intercepted transmissions, analyzed their primitive fusion drives and kinetic weapons, calculated their industrial capacity and military potential. The mathematics had been conclusive. Humanity should have fallen in less than a solar rotation. But the ship that now hung in the void, its hull scarred by what must have been thousands of engagements, was not supposed to exist. The energy readings made no sense. The configuration defied every principle of efficient design the Crithians had mastered over millennia. It was asymmetrical, brutal in its construction, festooned with weapon emplacements that seemed to have been added and modified in some desperate, ongoing evolution. This was not the ship of a civilization making its first stand. This was the ship of something that had been fighting far longer than the intelligence reports suggested. Jathik opened a communication channel, standard protocol for civilizations that had not yet understood their position in the natural order of things. Unidentified human vessel, you have entered Crithian-controlled space. Power down your weapons systems and prepare for integration into the Dominion. Resistance will result in the systematic destruction of your species. You have 1/10 of a cycle to comply. The response came not through the usual communication frequencies but across every spectrum simultaneously, a voice that seemed to bypass their equipment entirely and speak directly into the bridge. It was calm, almost conversational, carrying the weight of something that had long since moved beyond the need for posturing. This is Captain Marcus Chen of the UHSV Indomitable. Your armada consists of 417 capital ships, approximately 6,000 support vessels, and 3 planetary siege platforms. You've deployed in a standard envelopment formation, Beta 7 variant, which suggests you expect minimal resistance and prioritize the capture of infrastructure over complete destruction. Your weapons are primarily plasma-based, effective range approximately 200,000 kilometers, with a charge time of 7.3 seconds between volleys. Your shield harmonics operate on a rotating frequency that cycles every 42 seconds, and your command ship, the large one attempting to hide behind the third moon, has a reactor signature consistent with supporting your entire fleet's tactical network. The bridge fell silent. Jathik's primary neural cluster processed the impossibility of what had just occurred. The human had just recited their complete tactical disposition with precision that suggested not scanning technology, but intimate familiarity. As if the human had fought this exact configuration before. Many times before. You will withdraw from this system immediately, Captain Chen continued, his voice carrying no trace of anger or fear. You will relay to your Dominion command that human space is not for conquest. You will do this because I am giving you the opportunity to learn a lesson without paying its full price. This is not a negotiation. This is a courtesy I extend because, unlike you, I remember what it was like to believe that strength was measured in numbers. Jathik's combat instinct overrode his tactical confusion. The human was alone. One ship. The Dominion had 417. The mathematics was still conclusive. He gave the order to attack. What happened next would be analyzed in Crithian military academies for generations afterward, not as a battle, but as a fundamental reassessment of what warfare meant when waged against an opponent who had already destroyed the version of themselves that could be destroyed. The Indomitable did not move. It did not need to. The first wave of Crithian attack ships, 300 strong, accelerated toward the human vessel in a textbook assault formation. At 150,000 kilometers, they entered what should have been effective weapons range. The Indomitable's response was not defensive. Captain Chen had not come to defend. He had come to teach. The human ship's weapons batteries spoke with a precision that seemed almost contemptuous. Each shot found not just a target, but the exact vulnerable point in each attacking ship's design, the junction where the shield generators connected to the primary power grid, the spot where armor was thinnest to accommodate sensor arrays, the precise angle where kinetic rounds would tumble through multiple compartments before detonating in the reactor core. These were not the tactics of superior technology. This was the application of hard-won knowledge, purchased with blood and failure and the systematic destruction of every assumption about what was possible. Within 17 seconds, the first wave ceased to exist. Not destroyed in the sense of being reduced to debris, but systematically dismantled as if by a surgeon who had performed the same operation thousands of times and had long since moved beyond the need for conscious thought. The second wave fared no better. The third wave never launched. Jafik watched his tactical display transform from an orderly assault into a cascading failure as ship after ship simply stopped functioning, disabled by shots that seemed to know where each vessel would be before it arrived. "You're wondering how this is possible," Captain Chen's voice cut through the chaos on the Krithian command deck. "You're running calculations, checking your intelligence data, trying to understand how a single ship can predict and counter an entire fleet. Let me save you the processing power. You're not fighting human technology. You're fighting human experience. And we have been fighting longer than you can possibly imagine." Jafik's secondary neural cluster was already running probability analyses, searching for the explanation. The data made no sense. Humanity's first recorded spaceflight had occurred less than 300 solar cycles ago. Their first interstellar vessel had left their home system barely 50 cycles past. How could they possess this level of tactical sophistication? The answer came not from analysis but from memory, from the one piece of human cultural data that the Krithian Intelligence Division had flagged as significant but dismissed as evolutionary inefficiency. Humans fought themselves. Constantly. Obsessively. They had been refining the art of warfare not against external threats, but against their own species, for the entirety of their recorded history. While the Krithians had spent millennia conquering species that barely understood conflict, humanity had been locked in an endless civil war against the only opponent that could truly teach them themselves. "I was not always this," Captain Chen said, and now there was something in his voice that transcended the tactical situation entirely. It was the voice of someone speaking a truth that had cost him everything to learn. 20 years ago, I commanded a research vessel. We studied nebular formations. My greatest concern was publication deadlines. I had a wife named Sarah and a daughter named Emma who wanted to be a xenobiologist. I was weak in every way that mattered when strength was required. I was comfortable. I was certain. I was convinced that the universe was fundamentally comprehensible and that violence was a choice rather than an inevitability. The Indomitable weapons had stopped firing, but the Krithian fleet remained paralyzed. Something in the human captain's tone had communicated more effectively than weapons that moving forward would be the last decision they ever made. The Viridian swarm came to our sector without warning. They had a doctrine similar to yours: overwhelm and absorb. They encountered my research vessel first. I tried to negotiate. I tried to reason. I tried to surrender. They responded by taking my ship and everyone on it. They kept us alive for 3 weeks while they studied us, learning human physiology so they could more efficiently process our colony worlds. My wife died on day 4. My daughter lasted until day 17. I lasted because I was useful. Because I could explain how our technology worked. Because I was willing to betray everything to survive one more day. Jafik felt something unfamiliar coursing through his neural network, not fear, but recognition. The recognition that he was not hearing a warrior's boast but a confession from something that had been fundamentally remade by circumstances that left no room for the luxury of remaining what it had been. They made a mistake on day 21, Chen continued. They left me alone with an engineering terminal for 47 seconds. It was enough. Not enough to escape, but enough to trigger a cascading reactor failure that destroyed their processing ship and 8 support vessels. I killed 14,000 Viridians and myself. Except I didn't die. I woke up in a medical bay 3 days later. The few human ships in the sector had detected the explosion, investigated, and found me in an escape pod I didn't remember entering. I had survived while 217 of my crew, including everyone I loved, had not. The human captain paused, and, in that pause, Jathik understood that he was not hearing a story but a transformation narrative, the kind that existed in Krithian mythology but that no living Krithian had experienced. The death of oneself and the violent birth of another. I spent 6 months in psychological rehabilitation. The doctors said I had trauma, that I needed to process grief, that I should accept what happened and find a way to move forward. They were kind. They were professional. They were trying to save the person I had been. But that person was dead. He died in that Viridian processing center the moment he realized that all his education, all his moral certainty, all his belief in the fundamental rationality of existence was just a luxury purchased by the fact that he had never encountered something that wanted to unmake him. Jathik accessed the human database fragments the Dominion had captured. There were records, fragmentary but consistent, of an escalating conflict between humanity and multiple aggressive species. The timeline compressed in a way that suggested not linear progression but exponential acceleration, as if humanity had been forced to evolve at a rate that should have been biologically impossible. I begged them to let me return to duty. They refused. I was psychologically unfit. I had become obsessed with tactical analysis, with studying every species that had ever attacked a human vessel, with understanding not just how to survive but how to ensure survival permanently. So I discharged myself from their care, joined a civilian shipping company, and began fighting in the way I was capable of fighting. I destroyed the weak version of myself who believed that anything mattered except ensuring that what happened to me never happened to anyone else. The Indomitable began moving now, not toward the Krithian fleet but in a slow orbit around it, and Jathik realized with a neural spike of terror that the human was not threatening them. He was demonstrating. Showing them that at any moment in this encounter, the human ship could have positioned itself for optimal destructive effect, and had chosen not to. Over the next 10 years, I fought in 47 engagements. I studied every tactical manual humanity had ever produced. I analyzed every defeat and every victory with equal obsession. I learned to think like the enemy by destroying the part of myself that wanted to believe the enemy thought like me. I learned to predict movement patterns by eliminating every assumption about how I would move in their position. I learned to accept casualties not as failures but as data points. I became efficient. I became effective. I became something that could protect humanity because I had killed every part of myself that was too weak to do what protection required. The psychological profiles in the Krithian database had noted that humans demonstrated unusual attachment to their individual identities, that this was simultaneously a source of their creative innovation and their tactical weakness. But what Shen was describing was the opposite, the deliberate destruction of identity in service of transformation. The Krithians had no cultural analog for this. Their society was hierarchical, collective, and each individual fulfilled the role they were designed for. The concept of self-destruction as a path to strength was alien. It was also, Jathik was beginning to understand, potentially the most dangerous adaptation a species could develop. The Viridian swarm came to our primary colony worlds 5 years ago. They came with everything they had, certain that the mathematics of numbers would prevail. I was commanding a small patrol group at the outer system perimeter. 15 ships. They had 3,000. My crew was afraid. My officers recommended retreat. They were not wrong. By every conventional analysis, we should have withdrawn, regrouped, and prepared for a defensive stand closer to the colonies. Jathik pulled up the records of the Viridian swarm. They had been a peer competitor to the Krithian Dominion for resources in this sector. Past tense. The swarm had disappeared from all communication channels approximately 5 solar cycles ago. The Dominion had assumed they had overextended and collapsed, as aggressive species often did. Now Jathik was beginning to suspect a different explanation. I ordered my ships to attack. Not because I believed we could win, but because I had destroyed the part of myself that needed to survive. The crew thought I was insane. Perhaps I was. But insanity is just clarity that others are not yet ready to accept. We went in with a simple doctrine: every ship fights until it cannot fight, and, when it cannot fight, it becomes a weapon. We lost 11 ships in the first hour. But those 11 ships took 400 Viridian vessels with them. We learned their shield frequencies, their communication protocols, their tactical decision trees. We purchased that knowledge with blood, and then we used it. The Crithian fleet was receiving new orders from the Dominion command ship. Withdraw to defensive positions. Jathik ignored them. He needed to hear the rest. He needed to understand what his fleet was facing. The battle lasted 4 days. By the end, I had 9 ships remaining from an original defense force of 47. The Viridians had 16,000. By every mathematical analysis, we had lost. But mathematics only accounts for what is, not for what can be unmade. We had something they didn't. We had nothing left to lose because we had already accepted the loss. We fought like we were already dead, and that made us unkillable. Captain Chen's voice carried a weight now that seemed to press against the very hull of the Crithian ships. We didn't destroy the Viridian swarm. We unmade them. We learned to think like they thought, to predict like they predicted, to evolve faster than they could adapt. Every ship they destroyed taught us something new. Every tactic they employed became a weapon we could use against them. Within 6 months, they stopped coming to our space. Within a year, they had ceased to exist as a coherent civilization. Not because we were stronger. Because we were willing to become what strength required. The tactical analysis programs in Jathik's command suite were producing results now that made his neural clusters burn with the effort of processing. The human ship's weapon signatures matched 17 different civilization types. The hull configuration incorporated design principles from at least 30 different species. The Indomitable was not a ship. It was a monument to adaptation, a physical manifestation of the principle that survival belonged to those willing to abandon every preconception about what they were. You came to human space expecting to find a young civilization, easy to dominate, rich in resources, and weak in will. You came with 417 ships because your intelligence suggested that would be overwhelming force. Your intelligence was not wrong about humanity's industrial capacity or our technological level. Your intelligence failed to account for the one thing that cannot be measured in factory output or weapons ranges. You failed to understand that we have been fighting a war of self-destruction since before we left our home world. Every human who survives contact with true violence has already destroyed the weak version of themselves. We are not a civilization of individuals trying to become warriors. We are a civilization of survivors who had to kill the part of ourselves that couldn't protect what we loved. Jathik made a decision that would either save the Crithian Dominion or end his command. He opened a direct channel to the human ship, bypassing his own command structure. Captain Chen. You have made your point. We are withdrawing from this system. But, I must ask, as one commander to another, why did you not simply destroy us? You clearly had the capacity from the moment you arrived. The silence stretched for 7 seconds. When Chen spoke again, there was something different in his voice, not softer, but more human. As if speaking directly to another being had reminded him of something he had almost forgotten. Because I remember what it was like to believe that strength was enough. I remember commanding my research vessel and thinking that understanding the universe made me wise. I remember the certainty, the comfort, the belief that I could navigate any situation through intelligence and reason. And I remember the exact moment when that version of me died. It was not when the Viridians first attacked. It was not when they killed my wife. It was the moment I realized that all my education, all my ethics, all my carefully constructed worldview was just scaffolding around a fundamentally weak core. The moment I understood that I had to destroy everything I believed I was in order to become something that could prevent others from experiencing what I experienced. Jathik processed this. You are offering us the same opportunity. I am offering you the choice I never received. You can withdraw now, report to your dominion that human space is defended by something you don't understand, and perhaps they will listen. Perhaps they will realize that conquest is a luxury afforded to civilizations that have never encountered something willing to destroy itself completely in order to ensure the enemy cannot win. Or perhaps they will send more ships, convinced that numerical superiority must eventually prevail. If they make that choice, I will teach them the same lesson I taught the Viridians. Not because I want to. Because I destroyed the part of myself that had the luxury of wanting anything other than the absolute security of my species. The Crithian commander began issuing withdrawal orders. His fleet, confused but disciplined, started to disengage. As they did, Captain Chen transmitted one final message, and this time it was not addressed to Jathic alone but to every ship in the fleet, every recording system, every communication relay that would carry this moment back to the Dominion core worlds. I am Marcus Chen. 20 years ago, I was a scientist who believed the universe could be understood. 15 years ago, I was a survivor who had lost everything. 10 years ago, I was a warrior who had learned that victory requires the complete destruction of weakness. 5 years ago, I became something else, something that exists solely to ensure that humanity never again faces extinction because we were too comfortable, too certain, or too weak to do what survival demands. I am not the strongest human. I am not the smartest. I am not the most skilled. I am simply the one who destroyed every part of himself that could be destroyed by others. And, in doing so, I became indestructible. The Crithian fleet withdrew from the system in perfect formation, their sensors tracking the Indomitable until it vanished beyond scanning range. Jathic filed his report with utmost precision, knowing that it would be dismissed by Dominion Command as the exaggeration of a commander who had lost his nerve. He included every tactical detail, every energy reading, every word Captain Chen had spoken. He concluded with a recommendation that would end his military career: humanity should be classified as an existential threat and given absolute birth. The recommendation was rejected. 6 months later, the Dominion sent a grand armada to human space, 4,000 ships, the largest military force the Crithians had ever assembled. It was led by Supreme Commander Vothran, a tactical genius who had never lost an engagement, who dismissed Jathic's report as the fantasies of a broken mind. The armada encountered 17 human ships at the boundary of the system designated as Sol. Captain Chen's vessel was the first. The battle lasted 11 hours. When it was over, 3 human ships remained functional. The Crithian Dominion had lost its entire Grand Armada. Supreme Commander Vothran's final transmission, sent as his flagship broke apart, consisted of 3 words repeated in every Crithian dialect: "They cannot die." But that was not quite accurate. Humans could die. They died by the thousands in the defense of their space, in the protection of their colonies, in the endless war against species that saw them as resources to be harvested. What made them indestructible was not their biology or their technology. It was their willingness to destroy the version of themselves that could be destroyed. Every human who survived an encounter with extinction came back changed, harder, more focused, stripped of every luxury that weakness afforded. They became specialists in a form of warfare that most species never imagined was possible: the systematic destruction of their own limitations. Marcus Chen stood on the bridge of the Indomitable, watching the debris field that had been the Crithian Grand Armada scatter across the void. Around him, his crew worked in silent efficiency, each of them carrying their own transformation narrative, their own story of the person they had killed in order to become what survival required. Some had lost families. Some had lost worlds. Some had simply lost the comfortable certainty that the universe was fundamentally fair or comprehensible. Captain, his tactical officer, spoke quietly. "We're receiving a transmission from the Crithian Dominion. They're requesting a ceasefire and formal negotiations." Chen nodded slowly. This was the pattern. First came denial, then overwhelming force, then the slow recognition that humanity could not be conquered because humanity had already conquered the only opponent that mattered: themselves. The negotiations would be complex, delicate, fraught with the mutual understanding that neither side could afford unlimited conflict. The Crithians would withdraw from human space, establish formal boundaries, and begin the long process of rebuilding their doctrine around the recognition that some species could not be defeated because they had made defeat impossible. "Respond that we are willing to discuss terms," Chen said. "But make it clear that the terms are non-negotiable." Human space is sovereign. Any incursion will be met with total war. And total war against humanity means war against an opponent that has already accepted complete destruction and chosen to survive anyway. The message was sent. Over the following months, the Crithian Dominion and humanity negotiated the Treaty of Mutual Recognition, a formal agreement that established absolute boundaries and committed both sides to non-aggression. It was not peace in any ideal sense. It was the recognition between two apex predators that fighting to extinction served neither species. But the treaty did something else, something that neither side had fully anticipated. It forced the Crithians to examine their own assumptions about strength, about conquest, about the fundamental nature of military power. Dominion tacticians studied the human engagements obsessively, trying to understand the principle that allowed such a numerically inferior force to achieve consistent victory. They analyzed the tactical decisions, the weapons configurations, the communication patterns. And, slowly, reluctantly, they began to understand. The humans won not because they were stronger but because they had nothing left to protect except the future. Every other civilization the Crithians had conquered had been defending something: their traditions, their way of life, their cultural identity, their comfort. These things created vulnerabilities, attachment points that could be threatened and used to force capitulation. Humanity had systematically destroyed all of these attachments. They had reduced themselves to a single principle: survival. And, in doing so, they had become tactically perfect. It was Jothic, promoted to the Dominion Strategic Analysis Division after his initial report was vindicated by events, who first articulated the principle that would reshape Crithian military doctrine: the human capacity for self-destruction is their ultimate weapon. They do not defeat opponents through superior force. They defeat opponents by being willing to become whatever victory requires, regardless of what that transformation costs them. They are not defending who they are. They are defending the right to continue existing. And anything that exists solely to continue existing cannot be destroyed by external force. It can only destroy itself, and it will not do so while threats remain. The analysis spread through the Dominion's military academies, through their strategic planning divisions, through the civilian government that controlled resource allocation and long-term policy. It created a schism in Crithian society between traditionalists who believed the Dominion should continue its expansion and a growing reformist faction that argued humanity had revealed a fundamental flaw in the conquest model. If the ultimate form of military strength required the complete destruction of cultural identity, social cohesion, and individual purpose beyond survival, was conquest even desirable? The debate raged for cycles, but it was ultimately settled not by philosophical argument but by practical observation. Other species in the sector, observing humanity's successful defense against the Crithian Dominion, began adopting human tactical principles. They started training their military forces in human-style warfare, accepting casualties as learning opportunities, prioritizing adaptation over tradition, systematically destroying the psychological barriers that prevented total commitment to survival. Within a decade, the entire sector had transformed. Conquest became exponentially more expensive as every civilization adopted the human model of self-destructive strength. The Crithian Dominion, faced with the choice between endless war against opponents who fought like humanity or fundamental reform of their expansion doctrine, chose reform. It was not a moral choice. It was a practical recognition that the mathematics of conquest had changed. You could not conquer an opponent willing to destroy itself completely rather than accept subjugation. And, if every civilization in the sector was willing to do this, expansion through military force became economically and strategically untenable. On the 20th anniversary of the first human-Crithian contact, Marcus Chen stood before a joint assembly of human and Crithian military commanders. He was older now, his hair gray, his face carrying lines that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the weight of decisions that had killed thousands to save millions. The assembly had requested that he speak about the nature of human military doctrine, to explain for the historical record how humanity had achieved such disproportionate defensive success. Chen stood at the podium, looking out at an audience that represented dozens of species, each of them now grappling with the implications of humanity's example. He was quiet for a long moment, and, when he spoke, his voice carried none of the tactical certainty that had defined his combat communications. Instead, there was something else, a weariness, perhaps, or a sadness for what had been necessary. You ask me to explain how humanity defeated the Crithian Dominion. You ask me to reveal our tactical secrets, our strategic principles, the doctrine that allowed us to prevail. But, you're asking the wrong question. We did not defeat the Crithians. We simply refused to be defeated. And, there is a difference that matters more than any tactical analysis can capture. He paused, gathering thoughts that had been 2 decades in the forming. Every being in this chamber has something they would not sacrifice for victory. Every civilization represented here has lines they will not cross, principles they will not abandon, versions of themselves they refuse to destroy. These things make you civilized. They make you ethical. They make you, in the truest sense, alive. But, they also make you conquerable. Because anyone who knows what you will not sacrifice can use that knowledge as a weapon against you. The assembly was silent. Chen continued, humanity crossed those lines. We did not choose to. We were forced to by circumstances that gave us no alternative. When the Viridians came, when the Crithians came, when every aggressive species in this sector came to harvest our worlds, we had 2 choices, die as the people we were, or survive as something else entirely. We chose survival. And, the cost of that choice was everything that made us human in any sense that our ancestors would recognize. He looked directly at Jathic, who sat in the Crithian delegation, his sensory appendages focused entirely on the human captain. Commander Jathic asked me, during our first encounter, why I did not simply destroy the Crithian fleet. I told him that I remembered what it was like to believe that strength was enough. But, there's more to it than that. I didn't destroy your fleet because doing so would have destroyed the last part of myself that I cannot afford to lose, the part that remembers why survival matters. If I become so perfectly adapted to warfare that I cannot remember what I'm defending, then, I have not survived. I have simply become a weapon that happens to be made of flesh. The admission hung in the air like smoke. Chen's hands gripped the podium, and, for the first time in 20 years, those watching could see not the indestructible captain but the broken scientist underneath, still bleeding from wounds that would never fully heal. I want you all to understand something, Chen said, and now his voice was rough with emotion that tactical discipline could not quite suppress. What humanity has become is not a triumph. It is a tragedy that we survived. Every human who fights in our defense forces has destroyed parts of themselves that should never have needed destruction. We have children who train for war before they learn art. We have scholars who study xenocide patterns instead of cultural exchange. We have turned our entire civilization into a mechanism designed solely to prevent our extinction, and, in doing so, we have made ourselves unrecognizable to the people we were when we first reached for the stars. He straightened, and, the vulnerable moment passed, replaced by the certainty that had kept humanity alive through 2 decades of existential war. But, we would do it again. We would make the same choice in every possible timeline because the alternative is extinction. And, as long as there are species in this galaxy that view conquest as acceptable, humanity will maintain its capacity to destroy itself before allowing others to destroy us. This is not a threat. This is simply the reality of what we have become. The assembly adjourned in silence. No questions were asked. No clarifications were requested. Everyone present understood that they had witnessed not a lecture on tactics but a confession from something that had survived its own death and carried the scars to prove it. In the years that followed, the galactic community underwent a transformation that historians would later call the Great Recalibration. The human example had proven that conquest was no longer viable as an expansion strategy when civilizations were willing to adopt total war doctrines as defensive positions. Trade became more profitable than warfare. Cooperation became more efficient than subjugation. Not because species had suddenly become enlightened, but because humanity had demonstrated the ultimate counter to conquest, the complete destruction of everything except the will to survive. The Crithian Dominion became the Crithian Confederation, a voluntary association of species bound by trade agreements and mutual defense pacts rather than military occupation. It was not an ideological transformation but a practical one, driven by the recognition that the age of easy conquest had ended the moment humanity proved that numerical superiority meant nothing against an opponent with nothing left to lose. Marcus Chan lived another 30 years. He never retired from military service, though he transitioned from active combat command to strategic advisory roles. He trained 3 generations of human military officers, and his lectures became required study at every major military academy in human space. But those who knew him personally understood that he was not a warrior in any traditional sense. He was a monument to the cost of survival, a living reminder that victory in existential conflict required the sacrifice of everything that made existence meaningful. On the 50th anniversary of the first Krithian incursion, Chen gave one final address to a graduating class of human naval officers. He was 83 years old, his body failing in ways that even advanced medicine could not prevent. He stood before the young faces, each of them trained in the doctrine he had helped create, each of them prepared to destroy themselves if that's what humanity's survival required. You are standing here today because 5 decades ago, I and thousands like me made a choice. We chose to destroy the weak versions of ourselves rather than allow others to destroy us completely. That choice saved humanity. It also damned us. You are the inheritance of that damnation, trained from birth to be indestructible, raised in a civilization that has no room for weakness, educated in the systematic destruction of every limitation that might make you vulnerable. The graduates listened with perfect attention. Chen could see himself in their eyes, the certainty, the commitment, the terrible competence that came from growing up in a civilization built entirely around survival. I want you to remember something as you take command of your ships and sail out into a galaxy that still contains threats to our existence. What we have become was necessary. But necessary is not the same as good. We are indestructible because we destroyed everything about ourselves that could be destroyed. But, in doing so, we lost something precious. We lost the luxury of being human in the way my generation understood humanity: flawed, uncertain, vulnerable, but capable of art and love and wonder alongside all our capacity for violence. He gripped the podium, fighting against fatigue that was no longer just physical. Your mission is not just to defend humanity. Your mission is to defend the possibility that someday, humanity might be able to return to something resembling the people we were before we learned what survival really costs. Hold the line. Remain indestructible. But never forget that indestructibility is a means, not an end. The day we forget that is the day we complete our transformation from a civilization worth defending into a weapon that simply happens to be made of living beings. Chen died 3 months later. His funeral was attended by representatives from 47 species, including a large Krithian delegation led by Zhathik, now an elderly statesman who had spent his entire career working to ensure that the lessons of the human-Krithian conflict were never forgotten. The eulogy was delivered by Admiral Sarah Chen Rodriguez, the captain's daughter from a second marriage, a woman who carried her father's name and his burden with equal weight. My father was 2 people, she said, standing before the assembled gathering. There was Marcus Chen the scientist, who died in a Viridian processing center 53 years ago. And there was Captain Marcus Chen, who was born in that same moment and spent the rest of his life ensuring that no one else would have to experience that transformation. He destroyed himself so thoroughly that most of you only ever knew the second version. But I knew both. And I can tell you that the death of the first Marcus Chen was the most terrible casualty of the wars that forged modern humanity. She paused, looking out at the crowd. But I can also tell you that the second Marcus Chen saved billions of lives by being willing to become what salvation required. He was indestructible because he had nothing left that could be destroyed. And, in being indestructible, he made humanity indestructible. That is his legacy. That is our inheritance. And that is the burden we must carry until the day comes when humanity can afford to be weak again. The funeral concluded with a traditional human military ceremony, the playing of taps, a final salute, and the dispersal of Chen's ashes into space from the bridge of the Indomitable, the ship that had been his home for more than 4 decades. As the ashes scattered into the void, Admiral Chen Rodriguez stood at the viewport, watching them disappear among the stars. Rest now, she whispered. You've earned it. We'll hold the line. And they did. The generations that followed maintained the doctrine that Marcus Chen and his contemporaries had forged. They remained vigilant, prepared, indestructible. The galaxy learned to accommodate humanity not as equals but, as a cautionary example, a species that had survived by destroying every part of itself that could be destroyed, and, in doing so, had become something that could not be conquered because it had already conquered itself. The principle became known across the galactic community as Chen's doctrine: the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. It was studied in military academies, debated in strategic planning sessions, and referenced in diplomatic negotiations as the ultimate deterrent against aggression. Because everyone understood that you could not defeat an opponent who had already accepted total destruction and chosen to survive anyway. But there was another legacy, one that Marcus Chen would never see but that his daughter and the generations that followed worked to preserve. It was the memory of what humanity had been before it became indestructible. The art, the literature, the philosophy, the simple joy of existence that had characterized human civilization before.